Thus spake Irihal. Irihal is not a religious leader, nor a person interpreting the laws of God according to him, not someone who is imposing strictures on how one should conduct oneself. Irihal is merely a messenger, conveying and sharing some insights on how to become a better individual, a better human being. There is nothing called Irihalism, and it is far from any religious dogma, even though religion does form a portion of Irihal's sayings. Religion plays a huge role in today's day and age. It is a way for people to find meaning in their lives, forms a discipline on best practices, gives the faithful a sense of belonging to a particular community. However, what is seen is that the teachings of the various holy scriptures are often taken over by how the keepers of the faiths interpret them. According to Irihal, the ultimate purpose of every individual and every religion is to become better individuals, living in harmony with each other. Irihal says, it is not about whose God is better or stronger. It is more about how empathetic each individual is towards the rest of humanity. Irihal's sayings go beyond religion or spirituality or how to practice one's faith. It is about becoming a better individual. Jesus Christ said, "Behold, the kingdom of heaven is within you." Hinduism lays great emphasis on aham, the self. Similarly, Irihal says that I need to look within myself to become a better individual, regardless of what the rest of the world is doing. It is the I have to concentrate on, improve upon, and make it better than it was before. If all of humanity collectively bettered the I that is within each one, the world will become a better place, a place with zero conflict and immense empathy. Even though each of the sayings of Irihal begin with the phrase Irihal says, these are indicative of the kinds of beliefs Irihal believes people should imbibe and internalize. These are by no means cast in stone, and each individual has to understand the concept behind each statement and then, if necessary, modify it suitably for his or her individual needs, without contradicting the essence of the saying. Irihal's sayings are in no way exhaustive, and neither are they finite. They may be changed, modified, or entirely struck down, depending on evolving times and increasing wisdom. Irihal is just a messenger, conveying the message. Irihal is not a man, nor a woman, or androgynous. Irihal is the messenger, symbolized by fire, one of the elements that helps us live. Fire is constructive as well as destructive. If it is harnessed and the power unleashed, fire can be extremely beneficial. However, if its destructive powers are let loose, it can destroy everything in its path. We need to generate the fire within us and use it to burn all the negativity around us and embrace all its goodness and warmth. Irihal's sayings are milestones that can help people introspect and hopefully bring a semblance of reason in the way we live life. Irihal's sayings are a mere guide, milestones maybe, in the journey called life. Irihal believes that one should listen to the sayings, get into a conversation with either one's own conscience or with other people to figure out the efficacy of these sayings. Most times, truth is relative to the times we live in, the environment we find ourselves in, the culture we are surrounded by, the traditions that are a part of the society that envelops us. The sayings can and should be modified to suit the canvas we find ourselves painting on. There is nothing written in stone. Life evolves, and so do these sayings. Feel free to question. That is the only reality. These are the sayings of Irihal. One. Me and my world. 1.1. Irihal says, I have been born for a purpose. I will spend the rest of my life to find that purpose and to fulfill it. 1.2. Irihal says, I believe that all beings are born for a purpose, and each one has to find his or her own individual purpose. 1.3. Irihal says, I do not have any significant role to play in the process of others finding their purpose. 1.4. Irihal says, I believe that everyone is created equal, and I will neither look up to nor look down upon anyone else by whatever parameter. 1.5. Irihal says, I realize that it is not my job to change the world, but to do whatever is in my power to change myself to become a better human being. 1.6. Irihal says, I know that there is a lot of difference between literacy and education. 1.7. Irihal says, with education comes knowledge, but wisdom might still be a long way away. 1.8. Irihal says, I will always try and layer what little wisdom I gain with a healthy dose of compassion, so that I do not become arrogant. 1.9. Irihal says, I will try and live my life by accepting what fate has destined for me. 1.10. Irihal says, I sincerely believe that there is a lot to learn from every person, every experience. 1.11. Irihal says, I will learn to think for myself instead of blindly following someone else's thoughts and views, even if that person is my parent or teacher or guide or guru. 1.12. Irihal says, I will consciously seek teachers and gurus to absorb knowledge and to gain wisdom. 1.13. Irihal says, I will not put anyone on a pedestal just because he or she has been my guru or teacher. 1.14. Irihal says, when I outgrow my teacher or guru, I will consciously seek another from whom I can learn and absorb more knowledge. 1.15. Irihal says, I will learn from others who have more wisdom than me. I will use such knowledge gained to form my own opinion. 1.16. Irihal says, I realize that opinions, mine, others, or societies, are not written in stone. 1.17. Irihal says, I am at liberty to change my opinion as I gather more information. 1.18. Irihal says, I realize I do not have the wisdom to pass judgment on how other people conduct their lives. 1.19. Irihal says, I accept that all I can do is to live my life in the best possible way for the betterment of myself and for the people around me. 1.20. Irihal says, I will not cause hurt to any other person intentionally or unintentionally. 1.21. Irihal says, I will be careful of the words that come out of my mouth, since I know they can cause irreparable damage if they are hurtful. 1.22. Irihal says, it is not my job to convert other people to my way of thinking, but to live my life according to what I believe is best for me. 1.23. Irihal says, I realize that I am and will always be a student of life and can never reach a stage where I can announce that I know everything. 1.24. Irihal says, I will always apply my full and undivided concentration to the activity I am currently involved in and not get distracted. 1.25. Irihal says, I will try to live my life in a manner that I can be a benchmark for others to emulate, without making any effort at all to gain any appreciation or recognition. 1.26. Irihal says, I will always conduct myself with dignity and grace. 1.27. Irihal says, I will not feel elated, victorious, satisfied, or gain a sense of self if someone starts believing in these sayings. It is in their destiny to start believing or not. 1.28. Irihal says, I know that no one can insult me without my permission. 1.29. Irihal says, I realize that people will be unfair to me and I cannot control it, but I can control how I react to that stimulus. 1.30. Irihal says, I will love myself. If I do not love myself, I cannot expect other people to love me. 1.31. Irihal says, I know that I will die one day. I will try and live every day prior to that. 1.32. Irihal says, it is my life and only I can live it. By trying to follow others' advice on how I should live my life will only make both people unhappy. 1.33. Irihal says, I will live my life based on my needs, not on my wants. 1.34. Irihal says, I will stick to my beliefs and principles and will practice what I publicly proclaim, even if there is opposition from others. 1.35. Irihal says, I do not feel the necessity to conform to the traditions set by the society or the community I belong to. 1.36. Irihal says, if I am forced by circumstances to adhere to certain rituals and traditions that go against the grain of my beliefs, I will try and avoid being a part of that activity to prevent any possible controversy. 1.37. Irihal says, I realize that sometimes when it rains, I might get wet. 1.38. Irihal says, I know I will reach my destination in life. My endeavor is to see whether I can reach my destiny in life. 1.39. Irihal says, I know that going too far is better than not going far enough. 1.40. Irihal says, I will not be afraid to make mistakes. 1.41. Irihal says, I will try my best to learn from my mistakes and not repeat them. 1.42. Irihal says, I understand that right and wrong are mostly cultural and contextual and are not written in stone. 1.43. Irihal says, I will not judge others on the basis of what I believe to be either right or wrong. 1.44. Irihal says, I know I am a unique individual and I will constantly strive to be the best version of myself that I can be. 1.45. Irihal says, I have my life to live and I will not waste my time trying to be someone else. Two, me and my karma. 2.1. Irihal says, I will always take responsibility for my own thoughts, deeds, and actions without trying to find excuses outside of myself. 2.2. Irihal says, I do not know about reincarnation and rebirth, but the concept of karma answers the question, why me, when things go against what I consider my interests and wishes. 2.3. Irihal says, I believe in karma, or by whatever other name people choose to describe it. It is a system of reward and punishment for good or bad thoughts, deeds, and actions. 2.4. Irihal says, if I commit a good deed or have a good thought or perform a good action, I will be rewarded for it, and vice versa. 2.5. Irihal says, I believe that one good thought, deed, or action does not negate a previous bad thought, deed, or action. 2.6. Irihal says, every night before going to bed, I will look back at my day and look at my thoughts, deeds, and actions through the day and accurately answer whether they were positive or negative. 2.7. Irihal says, if during the day I have had more positive thoughts and actions, I'll consider the day a positive one. If the number of negative thoughts and actions are in a majority, the day has been wasted. 2.8. Irihal says, how people treat me is their karma. How I treat them or react to them is mine. 2.9. Irihal says, revenge or vengeance does not help. People who hurt me will eventually face their own karma. 2.10. Irihal says, I do not seek a karmic vengeance on anyone. That thought by itself is an accumulation of bad karma. 2.11. Irihal says, if I undertake a vengeful act, it is my karma and it will come back to bite me in the future. 2.12. Irihal says, if I sit back and wait to watch someone else's karma come back to bite them, I'm adding to my own bad karma by thinking in that manner. 2.13. Irihal says, how I treat others is my karma. My reaction to how people treat me is also my karma. 2.14. Irihal says, karma gives me the power to choose, but not to be immune from the consequences of my choice. 2.15. Irihal says, Waiting for others to forgive me is a waste of time. I will endeavor to forgive myself for the negative things I say, do, or think. 2.16 Irihal says, good times build confidence. Bad times build character. 2.17 Irihal says, I will not be punished for my anger, but by my anger. 2.18 Irihal says, karma does not have a use-by date. 2.19 Irihal says, what I sow through my thoughts and actions, I reap as karma. 2.20 Irihal says, karma always knows where I live, in every lifetime. 2.21 Irihal says, I can only control my thoughts and actions, not the results. 2.22 Irihal says, I have the freedom to do or say anything I want, but I am not immune to the consequences of such action or thought. 2.23 Irihal says, I will not let others' thoughts and actions disturb my peace. 2.24 Irihal says, I realize that karma is responsible for everything that happens in my life. 2.25 Irihal says, I will ultimately pay for or be rewarded for what I have allowed myself to become. 2.26 Irihal says, believing in or not believing in karma does not change its existence or its consequences on me. 2.27 Irihal says, there is no such thing as coincidence. It is all karma. 2.28 Irihal says, karma is getting what you deserve and deserving what you get. 2.29 Irihal says, my future is modified every time I do or say or think something. 2.30 Irihal says, I realize that everything is connected to everything else. 2.31 Irihal says, karma is like a boomerang. It returns to the person that throws it. 2.32 Irihal says, I cannot seek revenge and not have it affect my karma. 2.33 Irihal says, I may not think that I deserve misery and pain and suffering, but then it may just be my karma. 2.34 Irihal says, I do not worry about what other people say about me or do to me. It is my karma and their karma. 2.35 Irihal says, when you see good, learn from it. When you see bad, reflect on your own shortcomings. 3. Culture, traditions, rituals. 3.1 Irihal says, I understand that the concept of good and bad is subjective and each person has a different definition, and that the definitions can change within the civilization's life cycle. 3.2 Irihal says, I realize there are some things that are universally considered good, while others are considered universally bad. Stealing, lying, killing, etc. are and always will be bad traits. 3.3 Irihal says, society and cultures are a collective of individual thoughts and beliefs and are a cumulative result of what the majority in a particular committee of people believe to be good or bad. 3.4 Irihal says, I understand that individual habits, when followed by a larger set of people, become traditions, which, when they transcend generations, become the culture of that group of people. 3.5. Irihal says, culture does not make people. People make cultures. 3.6. Irihal says, culture has changed in the past and will change in the future. The culture of groups of people change over time. 3.7. Irihal says, it is not my agenda to influence or change or modify the prevalent culture of the group or groups I belong to. 3.8. Irihal says, I will learn to question and will not necessarily accept or follow what I am told. 3.9. Irihal says, I will try and find the answers to questions I have based on what I hear, learn, and experience from people who have more knowledge or wisdom than me. 3.10. Irihal says, I realize that there is something to be learned from everyone, and that wisdom is not limited to a person who has read a lot of books or has a bunch of degrees. 3.11. Irihal says, I will always have an open and inquisitive mind and will try and imbibe information that I have limited knowledge about. 3.12. Irihal says, I will always use logic to support my point of view and will try and never ever be a fundamentalist or radicalist in my opinions. 3.13. Irihal says, I realize that even the truth has many shades and can change from different perspectives. A 6 looks like a 9 from the opposite angle. 3.14. Irihal says, culture is a set of values, individual, not collective. 3.15. Irihal says, my culture and my traditions are the foundation on which my identity is built. 3.16. Irihal says, if I stubbornly hold on to my traditions, I succumb to the fallacy of permanence. 3.17. Irihal says, when I follow traditions blindly, I am giving up my right to think. 3.18. Irihal says, if I am not following a tradition, I might actually be at the cusp of beginning one. 3.19. Irihal says, following cultures and traditions is more about obedience to the established rules and less about finding oneself. 3.20. Irihal says, my individual culture and tradition is always subject to and open to change. I am ready to evolve given newly acquired knowledge and wisdom. 3.21. Irihal says, innovation, invention, and discovery by definition break tradition. These are the acts of defiance towards creating a better world. 3.22. Irihal says, tradition prevents me from reinventing myself and from becoming a better person tomorrow than I am today. 3.23. Irihal says, community culture and traditions makes people clones, preventing the eagles from flying higher than the level playing field. 3.24. Irihal says, tradition is a roadblock and a dead end. It should be modified, not inherited from the past. 3.25. Irihal says, just because everyone is doing something does not make it right. And just because no one is doing something does not make it wrong. 4. Religion and Spirituality. 4.1 Irihal says, I believe that God dwells within me, as me. 4.2 Irihal says, I will attempt to be a spiritual person and will refrain from being a religious person. 4.3 Irihal says, religion is something that people believe, atheists renounce, and politicians use. 4.4 Irihal says, I do not believe that God is interested in a theatrical performance, looking at how people dress, speak, act, eat, pray. 4.5 Irihal says, I will cultivate the wisdom and the strength to refrain from wanting to gain an identity by belonging to any particular religious, ethnic, or cultural group. 4.6 Irihal says, I will make a conscious effort to read and understand the scriptures of other faiths for a better understanding of what they are trying to propagate. 4.7 Irihal says, I accept that by being spiritual and not religious, I may not conform to the prevalent definition of faith and that I might be a part of a small minority. 4.8 Irihal says, I believe that the path and process of my spiritual practice is private and should never be a public spectacle. 4.9 Irihal says, if I cannot practice my faith due to the fact that I do not find the privacy I seek, I will postpone my practice to a future time and place. 4.10 Irihal says, if I find myself exposed to someone else publicly practicing his or her faith, even at the inconvenience of others, I will refrain from being judgmental about it. 4.11 Irihal says, my spiritual practice is a mental exercise and not a physical one. 4.12 Irihal says, I realize that every person has a right to practice his or her faith in the manner they choose, and I have no right to impose my opinion on them. 4.13 Irihal says, I will not be obsessed with the way I follow my faith, but I will be concerned about the direction my faith points to. 4.14 Irihal says, I do not accept that to be called either religious or spiritual, I have to follow prescribed rituals. I am at liberty to design my own rituals, my own unique way of practicing my faith. 4.15 Irihal says, I will defend the right of every other person to practice their own faith in the manner they choose, even if the process contradicts my own beliefs. 4.16 Irihal says, I do not believe in religious symbolism. The only symbols I pay obeisance to are the elements, without which all of us will perish: sun, wind, water, and fire. 4.17 Irihal says, I am at liberty to choose any symbol to represent these elements. 4.18 Irihal says, I realize that I am but a minuscule part of infinite space. 4.19 Irihal says, if I choose some symbolism, I will not identify myself with the symbol, but will be consciously aware that the symbol is just a symbol and is perishable. 4.20 Irihal says, I accept that what is eternal is the element the symbol symbolizes, and that the element will always remain in ascendancy relative to its symbol. 4.21 Irihal says, In case I get into a discussion with someone who is not using logic to support his or her views and beliefs, I will refrain from continuing the discussion instead of getting into an argument. 4.22. Irihal says, I do not accept that God can be bribed, and I will not indulge in a transactional relationship by promising a future benevolence if God grants my wishes. 4.23. Irihal says, I do not believe that God is either hard of hearing or visually challenged, and I will not practice my faith by indulging in public displays of my practice. 4.24. Irihal says, if I merely follow a ritual, I lose my capacity to think. It makes me impotent. 4.25. Irihal says, religion is not a roadmap to morality. If I cannot distinguish right from wrong, good from bad, it is not religion that I need, but the development of compassion. 4.26. Irihal says, I see religions talk about and preach the necessity of love, but I find that love itself is irreligious. 4.27. Irihal says, if all religions preach peace, why is it that more people in history have died in the name of religion than for any other cause? 4.28. Irihal says, there is a lot of hate in the world because some people want other people to love their religion instead of their own. 4.29. Irihal says, my religion does not define me. My character does. 4.30. Irihal says, the finest religions teach tolerance. I'm still trying to find one that is truly tolerant. 4.31. Irihal says, if I have to justify to others why my religion is the best, it cannot be my religion. 4.32. Irihal says, religion makes life good on the outside, while spirituality makes life good from the inside. 4.33. Irihal says, I do not need to be an atheist to be secular. 4.34. Irihal says, spirituality is a personal conversation with God, while religion is crowd control. 4.35. Irihal says, I will not be bogged down by culture and tradition to define when and how and in what manner I should practice my faith. I am at liberty to choose the time and place and manner of my practice. 5. Places of worship. 5.1. Irihal says, my body, my heart, and my mind is my temple, the only one I need. 5.2. Irihal says, I will never discriminate between places of worship of different faiths. 5.3. Irihal says, if I visit a place of worship or the home of a fellow human being, I will follow the rules and regulations they set for themselves. 5.4. Irihal says, I will visit a place of worship with a clean mind. It does not matter that I do not have a clean body, that I may not have had a bath, or that I am wearing yesterday's clothes, or have consumed food prior to the visit. 5.5. Irihal says, I will never approach a place of worship with an expectation of subsequent benevolence. 5.6. Irihal says, I will never promise a donation subject to the fulfillment of my wishes. I cannot bribe a power that is superior to me. 5.7. Irihal says, if ever I visit a place of worship, it will be to convey my thanks for the largesse bestowed on me. 5.8. Irihal says, I do not need to be at a designated place of worship in order to pray. I can do it at any place I find myself in. 5.9. Irihal says, I do not believe my God is either blind or deaf. I do not need public displays of my prayer for God to believe that I am praying. 5.10. Irihal says, I can define and design my own individual place of worship. It can be the music room for a musician, the gym for the bodybuilder, the studio for the cameraman. 5.11. Irihal says, visiting a place of worship is like visiting a community center. It provides a person a sense of belonging to a larger group. 5.12. Irihal says, no piece of stone can be more powerful than the strength of the heart and the cleanliness of the mind of an individual. 5.13. Irihal says, I will first try to discover myself from within before I enter a place of worship to find a reason for my existence. 5.14. Irihal says, I do not believe that God follows certain calendars, Julian, Gregorian, Hijri, Panchang, Hebrew, Tibetan, or any other. People do. 5.15. Irihal says, when I come face to face with my own ignorance, I find myself at the doorstep of the temple of wisdom. 5.16. Irihal says, my body is the temple where my God lives. 5.17. Irihal says, the sounds from nature and the laughter of an infant are music to my ears, much more melodious than the sound of a temple bell. 5.18. Irihal says, if I have to visit God, I do not need to meet the priest. 5.19. Irihal says, I think temples should be built with love, not with stones. 5.20. Irihal says, I would rather extend my hands to help than join them to pray. 5.21. Irihal says, pray with spirit and with truth. You do not need to be in a temple for that. 5.22. Irihal says, a place of worship places us in a surrounding that seems to be bigger and more important than our individual selves. If one can transcend that, we do not need a specific place of worship. 5.23. Irihal says, continue to pray even if you leave the place of worship. If not, you're just showing off. 5.24. Irihal says, religious liberty, by its very definition, goes beyond the periphery of a place of worship. 5.25. Irihal says, if you want to talk to God, go to a place of worship. If you want God to talk to you, stay wherever you are. 6. Meditation. 6.1. Irihal says, I will practice meditation as much as I can, as often as I can. 6.2. Irihal says, I believe meditation to be a process of looking inwards and cleansing the mind. 6.3. Irihal says, the process of meditation is less important than its purpose, and I will practice it however I can, standing, sitting, or lying down, walking, running, or driving, playing or reading, working or relaxing. 6.4. Irihal says, I realize that the mind is a cacophonic space, and I need to only allow important thoughts to enter, and bar any thoughts that are detrimental to my well-being. 6.5. Irihal says, I believe that meditation allows me to calm what is called the monkey mind. 6.6. Irihal says, meditation takes my mind on a wonderful journey, discovering facets of existence and a myriad possibilities that I never knew existed. 6.7. Irihal says, I will never be judgmental about the thoughts that enter my mind during meditation. I will just be aware of them and allow them to pass. 6.8. Irihal says, meditation teaches me the difference between thoughts and feelings. 6.9. Irihal says, meditation is all about awareness, about being entirely dispassionate. 6.10. Irihal says, meditation is the language of my soul. 6.11. Irihal says, there is more than enough time to practice meditation, particularly when I am busy doing other things. 6.12. Irihal says, meditation is a stronger force than prayer. While meditating, I take control of myself. While in prayer, I abdicate that responsibility to someone else. 6.13. Irihal says, meditation is about being in the moment. No right or wrong, day or night, today or tomorrow. It is just the here and now. 6.14. Irihal says, meditation is not about avoiding the world around me. It is about developing the insight to be able to better deal with the world within me. 6.15. Irihal says, meditation is not about chanting or sitting in a particular posture. It is about calming the mind. 6.16. Irihal says, I have to find my own method and process, and how, when, and for how long I want to meditate. 6.17. Irihal says, meditation is the finest relationship I can have with my mind. 6.18. Irihal says, I will take every opportunity to meditate. For instance, if I am cold and wet in the rain, I will consider it rain meditation or cold meditation. 6.19. Irihal says, meditation brings me face to face with the reality of life, not what I want life to be like. 6.20. Irihal says, the ultimate purpose of meditation is to become conscious about my true consciousness. 6.21. Irihal says, meditation is about moving from a mind that is full to being mindful. 6.22. Irihal says, my goal in meditation is to have an empty mind, a quiet heart, and a static tongue. 6.23. Irihal says, meditation is a practice and a process, not an end by itself. I will not take it too seriously. Even if I have missed it for a couple of days, no worries. I will accept it and move on. 6.24. Irihal says, meditation is immensely liberating. It liberates me from getting attached to my thoughts. 6.25. Irihal says, meditation is about finding and falling in love with that unique space between my thoughts. 6.26. Irihal says, a good meditator is one who meditates. A bad meditator is one who does not meditate. 6.27. Irihal says, meditation is a process through which I can replace wrong ideas I have about myself. All I have to do is to stop believing them. 6.28. Irihal says, through meditation I can look right through my illusions. 6.29. Irihal says, when I first start to meditate, I should not get frightened by the experience of facing my own thoughts. 6.30. Irihal says, brilliant things start to happen inside a calm mind. 6.31. Irihal says, the purpose of meditation is to discover the I. Once discovered, it disappears and wisdom takes its place. 6.32. Irihal says, be as free as the ego, but strive to be free from the ego. 6.33. Irihal says, I realize that my mind is in a constant state of flux and bombarded with many simultaneous thoughts. 6.34. Irihal says, I will try to reduce the turbulence in the mind due to thoughts that come in uninvited during the practice of meditation or any other activity I am indulging in. 6.35. Irihal says, I will always try and give my 100% concentration to whatever task I'm involved in, emotional, spiritual, physical. 6.36. Irihal says, I understand that distractions to my practice are mostly either sensual or perceptual. 6.37. Irihal says, in case it is difficult to relegate my immediate thoughts, I will postpone my meditation, address the thought, and then go back to my practice. 6.38. Irihal says, distractions are everywhere. Notice the distraction, accept it, and then let it go. 6.39. Irihal says, meditation is the practice of being able to see the clear blue sky through the thickness of dark clouds. 6.40. Irihal says, meditation is the art of getting to know and becoming comfortable with who we really are and can become. 6.41. Irihal says, meditation helps us change what is happening with us, since often we cannot change what is happening outside us. 6.42. Irihal says, the quieter the mind, the louder you can hear yourself. 6.43. Irihal says, meditation teaches us to take ourselves a little less seriously. 6.44. Irihal says, when the mind is calm, there is no room for anger. 6.45. Irihal says, meditation is about letting go of attachments. 6.46. Irihal says, meditation is like watching a flower blossom, a flower that was lying dormant within us. 6.47. Irihal says, meditation teaches us what not to do. 6.48. Irihal says, at the very least, meditation helps us make sense of life. 6.49. Irihal says, the soul will start to speak when the mind is calm. 6.50. Irihal says, meditation makes us feel our feelings be aware of them, accept them as they are. 6.51. Irihal says, when you meditate, you hear the universe. 6.52. Irihal says, meditation can still the flickering of a candle in the wind. 6.53. Irihal says, the goal of meditation is to become more aware of our thoughts and emotions and learn how to navigate through them. 6.54. Irihal says, meditation is like going out on an intimate date with our soul. 6.55. Irihal says, witness the mind, do not go to war with it. 7. Life and living. 7.1. Irihal says, I will always look at today as the first day for the rest of my life. 7.2. Irihal says, I am the sum total of all my experiences. 7.3. Irihal says, with boredom comes philosophy. 7.4. Irihal says, I will remember that life is not as complicated as it seems or I sometimes make it out to be. 7.5. Irihal says, I will watch what I say, since it is better to be silent and remain a fool than to speak and remove all doubts. 7.6. Irihal says, I will not worry about the angels who fear to tread where fools rush in, since they were perhaps fools who rushed in. 7.7. Irihal says, I will commit myself totally to what is at hand. I know that I cannot cross a chasm in 2 small steps. 7.8. Irihal says, I will never be biased about people or circumstances, since even a bad coin has 2 sides. 7.9. Irihal says, I realize that the safe route is usually the risky route, only hidden. 7.10. Irihal says, I will treat life like a rose bush with thorns, and not like a thorn bush with roses. 7.11. Irihal says, I will not rush through life. In my journey, I will stop to smell the roses. 7.12. Irihal says, I will always remember that life is not always fair. 7.13. Irihal says, I will always be on the lookout for love, since it has a way of sneaking into the heart when I least expect it. 7.14. Irihal says, there is no place lonelier than an empty heart. 7.15. Irihal says, I will strive for the innocence of a child, the maturity of an adult, the exuberance of youth, the salary of a CEO, and someone to share it with. 7.16. Irihal says, I could have been born with 2 mouths and 1 ear. I will strive to listen more than I talk. 7.17. Irihal says, I will resist a flood of words, since they seldom hide a drop of reason. 7.18. Irihal says, I will learn and cultivate the art of silence. 7.19. Irihal says, silence is a fence around wisdom. 7.20. Irihal says, I will learn from a dog, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health. 7.21. Irihal says, every once in a while I will reach out and touch the stars. 7.22. Irihal says, I will never give up 5 minutes before the miracle. 7.23. Irihal says, I will never give up on anybody. Miracles happen every day. 7.24. Irihal says, I will never deprive someone of hope. It might be the only thing they have left. 7.25. Irihal says, it's never over till it is over, and it is never over. 7.26. Irihal says, I will always keep an open mind, since it is like a parachute and only works when it is open. 7.27. Irihal says, life is a journey, and I will enjoy the view. Look as the sun rises, watch a flower bloom, look at the rocks grow. 7.28. Irihal says, I will always strive to climb out of any metaphorical cage I find myself in. If I live in a cage for too long, the world can look like a big scary place. 7.29. Irihal says, I realize that great grief suppressed in the heart can give rise to great anger. 7.30. Irihal says, I believe that there should not be any cause to compare one's joys, sorrows, and pains with anyone else's. Each emotion is unique, and I can only realize the depth of my own personal joys, sorrows, and pains. 7.31. Irihal says, I will never discriminate against any person based on gender, faith, race, color, caste, ethnicity, or any other parameter. 7.32. Irihal says, if others hurt me based on my gender, faith, caste, ethnicity, etc., I will take it in my stride and believe it is for my accumulated karma, either in this lifetime or in some prior lifetime. 7.33. Irihal says, I will always step forward to support the underdog, the persecuted, the one in minority, the underprivileged. 7.34. Irihal says, the underprivileged, the underserved, the minorities of all kinds, all deserve my absolute understanding and unstinting support. 7.35. Irihal says, I will not indulge in idle gossip about anyone or anything. 7.36. Irihal says, life is like sailing a boat solo. I need to be positive all the time. If I am negative, I will surely sink. 7.37. Irihal says, my life is not about finding answers, but about the journey of life itself. 7.38. Irihal says, my life is not about the final destination, but about the road I take to reach that destination. 7.39. Irihal says, when entrusted with a secret, I will keep it. 7.40. Irihal says, I will hold my heroes to a higher standard. 7.41. Irihal says, I will try and not put people up on pedestals. 7.42. Irihal says, I will never allow a wishbone to grow where my backbone should be. 7.43. Irihal says, I will be happy with and by myself and not look for external crutches for happiness or contentment. 7.44. Irihal says, If I find myself in a leadership position, I will always give credit and take the blame. 7.45. Irihal says, quit talking and start doing. 8. Self-esteem. 8.1. Irihal says, I am who I think I am. 8.2. Irihal says, I realize that it is difficult to climb out of the limitations of my own character, but I will try anyway. 8.3. Irihal says, if I do not know how to dream, I am dead. 8.4. Irihal says, vision without action is a daydream, and action without vision is a nightmare. 8.5. Irihal says, it takes just a spark to start a raging fire. 8.6. Irihal says, I am generally a better version of myself if someone else is watching, so I will watch myself. 8.7. Irihal says, I think, therefore I am. I dream, therefore I live. 8.8. Irihal says, what the caterpillar calls the end of the world, the master calls a butterfly. 8.9. Irihal says, the only lasting partnership is between me and myself. 8.10. Irihal says, I love me. If I don't, who will? 8.11. Irihal says, I will try and make my own footsteps in the sands of time. I will walk off the beaten track and leave a trail behind. 8.12. Irihal says, I will not walk on others' footsteps. Then I leave none of my own. 8.13. Irihal says, there is magic in thinking big. 8.14. Irihal says, I will not be among those people occupying hospital beds afflicted with emotionally induced illness. 8.15. Irihal says, I will love people for what they are and not for who they are. 8.16. Irihal says, life does not treat me bad. It is how I react to what life deals me that makes life look bad. 8.17. Irihal says, there is no shame in falling as long as I am prepared to get up and run again. 8.18. Irihal says, I will develop the courage to live. Anyone can die. 8.19. Irihal says, I will ask myself often, when was the last time I did something for the first time? 8.20. Irihal says, no one can insult me without my permission. 8.21. Irihal says, I will never consent to crawl when I have the impulse to soar. 8.22. Irihal says, I will write down all my dreams, hopes, and aspirations and constantly revisit them to see how far I still have to go. 8.23. Irihal says, I will revisit my list of dreams and modify them with time, if necessary, since everything changes, including dreams. 8.24. Irihal says, I will be confident and humble at the same time, but never arrogant. 8.25. Irihal says, perfection is utopia, and I will constantly strive to become a better person today, than I was yesterday. 8.26. Irihal says, if I lack in self-esteem and self-confidence, I will always remain a doormat. 8.27. Irihal says, I deserve my devotion, love, and affection. 8.28. Irihal says, I am unique and I define myself. I will not be dictated by how someone else defines me. 8.29. Irihal says, it is not terrifying to want to love yourself. 8.30. Irihal says, I will never surrender my dignity. 8.31. Irihal says, I never live my life answering the question, what will people say? 8.32. Irihal says, I refuse to allow other people's thoughts and opinions about me to poison my life. 8.33. Irihal says, I do not need validation from anyone. I am whole and complete by myself. 8.34. Irihal says, I do not indulge in self-pity. 8.35. Irihal says, I know the faults in me and no, they are not a reflection of what other people label as my faults. 9. Work and vocation. 9.1. Irihal says, I will never get a second chance to make a first impression. 9.2. Irihal says, education starts where qualifications end. 9.3. Irihal says, the reality of life is that who I know is often more important than what I know. 9.4. Irihal says, I will never become indispensable at my job. I will never get promoted. 9.5. Irihal says, I will be kind and generous to those I cross on the ladder of success. I might need them on the way down. 9.6. Irihal says, if I realize my littleness, my greatness will blossom. 9.7. Irihal says, everyone has talent. What is rare is the courage to follow the talent to the place where it leads. 9.8. Irihal says, one climbs an inch by inch, but falls yard by yard. 9.9. Irihal says, I will be careful how much I drink. I could lose my reputation in one evening. 9.10. Irihal says, I will always admonish in private, but praise in public. 9.11. Irihal says, behind every problem lies an opportunity. 9.12. Irihal says, if I look at problems as situations, solutions will emerge. 9.13. Irihal says, a camel is a horse designed by a committee. 9.14. Irihal says, I will always try smarter, not harder. 9.15. Irihal says, if at first I don't succeed, I will try again. If I fail again, I will move on. There is no point being a damn fool about it. 9.16. Irihal says, I always take advice, but am my own boss and my harshest critic. 9.17. Irihal says, working for someone is like sitting in a train. It is the train that is moving, with me sitting still inside. 9.18. Irihal says, even if I'm working for someone else, I'm working for myself. I'm getting paid to learn from someone else's mistakes and successes. 9.19. Irihal says, I realize that smarts and wealth often run on parallel tracks. 9.20. Irihal says, it matters whose name is on the door or on the building. 9.21. Irihal says, I will earn respect. I will not demand it, and I will not expect it. 9.22. Irihal says, I will develop the strength of character to hire people who will tell me how to do what I want to do. 9.23. Irihal says, the difference between the ordinary and the extraordinary is just a little bit extra. 9.24. Irihal says, it is often quite enough to do ordinary things extraordinarily well. 9.25. Irihal says, failures are the pillars on which success builds its foundation. I will constantly dare to fail. 9.26. Irihal says, big problems hide big opportunities. 9.27. Irihal says, when I pursue greatness, I represent the courage that others don't have. 9.28. Irihal says, when the going gets weird, the weird turns pro. 9.29. Irihal says, I will always remember that every time I open my mouth, there is a chance I will put my foot in it. 9.30. Irihal says, if at first an idea is not absurd, there is no future in it. 9.31. Irihal says, I was born with many talents. I just need to discover what they are. 9.32. Irihal says, I stay away from people who say that I can't. 9.33. Irihal says, when someone points out my deficiencies and incapabilities, often they are merely projecting their own. 9.34. Irihal says, if I do not follow my dreams, others will hire me to build theirs. 9.35. Irihal says, belief is the strongest motivator. 9.36. Irihal says, a positive mental attitude does more to fulfill goals than all the knowledge in the world. 9.37. Irihal says, if you are passionate about what you do, you will not have to work a single day in your life. 9.38. Irihal says, the last and final minuscule effort is the difference between success and failure. 9.39. Irihal says, if two people in an organization agree with each other, one of them is redundant. 9.40. Irihal says, if everything seems to be in control, you are doing something wrong. 9.41. Irihal says, I love to dream, I love to imagine, I love to predict possibilities. 9.42. Irihal says, it is much more satisfying to die chasing a passion than to die of boredom. 9.43. Irihal says, everyone is busy charting their own course. Chances are you are not part of that plan. 9.44. Irihal says, Success comes to those who dare to fail. 9.45. Irihal says, the universe cannot allow you to do something any more than stopping you from doing it. 10. Nature and environment. 10.1. Irihal says, I am a product of nature and not the other way around. 10.2. Irihal says, I will always try and reduce my impact on nature. 10.3. Irihal says, I will reduce my usage of plastic products, particularly single-use plastic products like straws, shopping bags, cups, plates, spoons, bottles, etc. 10.4. Irihal says, I realize that I need nature to live, but that nature is quite happy without humans. 10.5. Irihal says, success without protecting the environment will ultimately lead to our extinction. 10.6. Irihal says, I am a fool if I believe that I can control nature. I can only push nature so much. 10.7. Irihal says, pollution is incurable but preventable. 10.8. Irihal says, if I do not sustain nature, nature will not sustain humanity. 10.9. Irihal says, a flower looks best in the meadow, not in a vase. 10.10. Irihal says, it is much easier to create a desert than it is to create a forest. 10.11. Irihal says, the environment will be best preserved if all mankind suddenly disappeared. It will revert to the wonderful equilibrium that existed before man started trying to dominate nature. 10.12. Irihal says, I will not join the experiment to find out how much pollution nature can bear. 10.13. Irihal says, I run in nature, not in a gym. I will not do anything to change this reality by adding to pollution. 10.14. Irihal says, if I protect water and air, I am protecting the future of mankind. 10.15. Irihal says, there is no planet B. Protect this one. 10.16. Irihal says, I will be reverential to nature. She can quickly and easily destroy anything created by me. 10.17. Irihal says, if I cut down all the trees, there will not be any more need for sawmills. 10.18. Irihal says, if Earth were to pray, humans would be depicted as the devil. 10.19. Irihal says, I look at life on Earth not as one handed down by my ancestors, but one that I borrow from my children. 10.20. Irihal says, only one person is responsible for cleaning the environment, me, and 8 billion plus other people like me. 10.21. Irihal says, in the industrial age, I am not rushing towards the future, but speeding towards my own destruction. 10.22. Irihal says, time spent in the wilderness is not time wasted. 10.23. Irihal says, nature will survive. Will we? 10.24. Irihal says, the universe does not belong to us. We belong to it. 10.25. Irihal says, anything built by humans can be destroyed by nature. 11. Children. 11.1. Irihal says, "If I am the parent of my children, it is my responsibility to always love and cherish them." 11.2. Irihal says, "My children did not volunteer to be born. They came into this world because I wanted them in my life." 11.3. Irihal says, "I will never ever draw comparisons between my child and anyone else, including between two or more of my own children." 11.4. Irihal says, "I will never expect my children to be my support in my sunset years. I will be appreciative if they do, but will not be sad if they don't." 11.5. Irihal says, "I will teach my children how to think, not what to think." 11.6. Irihal says, "There is a lot to learn from children unencumbered by the niceties of diplomacy." 11.7. Irihal says, "I will try and keep the child in me remain a child for as long as I possibly can." 11.8. Irihal says, "The best thing I can do for my children is to teach them to color outside the lines." 11.9. Irihal says, "I will create a happy childhood for myself and my children, starting now." 11.10. Irihal says, "My children are my children, and I will never forsake them. My porch lights will always be on, waiting for them to come home." 11.11. Irihal says, "I will learn to live like a child. The only true and unadulterated state of joy lies in the laughter of an infant." 11.12. Irihal says, "I will teach my children not necessarily to strive for greatness, but to discover the wonders of an ordinary life." 11.13. Irihal says, "I will prepare my children for the future instead of hoping for a future for my children." 11.14. Irihal says, "My children are not Hindu or Muslim or Sikh or Christian or Jew. They are just children. I will allow them to learn and respect all faiths without the pressure of following one due to heredity." 11.15. Irihal says, "Every once in a while I will walk in the shoes of a child to see the world in all its glory, full of possibilities." 11.16. Irihal says, "The best children are those who grow up knowing they can disagree with me, backed by sound logic." 11.17. Irihal says, "Children are often superior in their thinking to adults, since they are not burdened with an education." 11.18. Irihal says, "I will not raise my children to live a life of conformity." 11.19. Irihal says, "The best possible way to raise mentally and emotionally healthy children is to keep them as far away from organized and ritualistic religion as possible." 11.20. Irihal says, "I might have something to do with looking after the children physically and emotionally, but I will be stupid to try and control their souls." 11.21. Irihal says, "The easiest way to get a child to do something is to tell them not to do it." 11.22. Irihal says, Children are a lifelong commitment, not a hobby. 11.23. Irihal says, if you are looking to give birth to a child to rid you of your loneliness, get a dog instead. 11.24. Irihal says, try and be an adult who never outgrew childhood. 11.25. Irihal says, children need models and not critics. 12. Women. 12.1. Irihal says, I believe that women in society have an equal status, if not a higher status, since they are the ones bringing new generations to the world. 12.2. Irihal says, I will always stand up to fight for the rights of women, more so if I find them to be discriminated against due to their gender. 12.3. Irihal says, I believe that women are not property to be donated or given away at the time of their wedding. 12.4. Irihal says, I do not believe that parents of the girl child are burdened with the curse of having a girl child. 12.5. Irihal says, I believe that a woman is more empathetic to the emotional needs of the people around them because they are inherently nurturing by nature. 12.6. Irihal says, I believe that all women should be economically independent and not have to rely on the largesse bestowed on them by their male counterparts. 12.7. Irihal says, I believe women to be objects of beauty to be appreciated and loved, but not objects of lust to be exploited and dominated. 12.8. Irihal says, it is not a competition between men and women, it is a collaboration. 12.9. Irihal says, jobs and careers do not have any gender. 12.10. Irihal says, there are many things that women are superior at performing, and there are those where men are more suited. It is not a competition. 12.11. Irihal says, it is an educated woman that changes and transforms societies and cultures. 12.12. Irihal says, women need to be the voice, not the echo. 12.13. Irihal says, education is the finest way to empower women. 12.14. Irihal says, women do not need a knight in shining armor. They need to wield the sword. 12.15. Irihal says, I will show the women in my life the glass ceiling and not get them to try on the glass slippers. 12.16. Irihal says, I will impress upon girls not to become the girl who needs a man, but to become the girl that a man needs and seeks. 12.17. Irihal says, a woman's self-confidence, self-esteem, and self-worth is not measured by the approval of others, particularly men. 12.18. Irihal says, women will be truly empowered when the shop board says Gupta and daughters instead of Gupta and sons. 12.19. Irihal says, hopefully one day soon there will only be leaders and not men leaders or women leaders. 12.20. Irihal says, a woman does not require a man's chivalry or permission to do what she wants to do, is capable of achieving. 12.21. Irihal says, empower a woman and you empower the world. 12.22. Irihal says, when we deprive women, we deprive half the population, and that is the disgrace to our demographic dividend. 12.23. Irihal says, women need to also defy the stereotypes they hold about themselves. 12.24. Irihal says, women need to stop apologizing for being women. 12.25. Irihal says, men and women together need to change the things that they cannot and should not accept. 13. Expectations and acceptance. 13.1. Irihal says, I will try and reduce expectations of what others can do for me. 13.2. Irihal says, I will not waste my time in trying to fulfill the expectation others have of me. 13.3. Irihal says, I realize that everyone else does not exist to fulfill my expectations from and of them. 13.4. Irihal says, happiness comes from external stimulus, contentment from within ourselves. 13.5. Irihal says, I believe that happiness lies inside of me and is not dependent on external crutches. 13.6. Irihal says, my happiness and contentment does not depend on a bigger house, a bigger car, a better phone, or number of friends. 13.7. Irihal says, there is nothing outside of me and no one else who can influence my contentment. 13.8. Irihal says, my happiness is within me and is a function of my reaction to external stimuli. 13.9. Irihal says, there is nothing that is external to me that dictates or controls my happiness. 13.10. Irihal says, I realize that my reaction to the same stimulus can bring about happiness or sorrow, depending on how I react to it. 13.11. Irihal says, a negative mind will never give you a positive life. 13.12. Irihal says, be aware of people who ooze negativity. They will not be able to add to your happiness, but will pull you down into the muck with them. 13.13. Irihal says, breathe deeply and everything shall pass. 13.14. Irihal says, I will continue to suffer greatly if I have an emotional reaction to everything negative that is said to me or about me. 13.15. Irihal says, I do not do anything good because of the happiness or satisfaction it provides me. If I did, I would be doing business, not goodness. 13.16. Irihal says, I refuse to be angry at anything because for each 60 seconds of anger, I lose 1 minute of happiness. 13.17. Irihal says, if I choose to be happy, I will be happy. 13.18. Irihal says, find time to waste time. It is never wasted time if you learn something from it. 13.19. Irihal says, ultimately, happiness lies in my heart, and I can choose to be happy or sad. External things do not affect me. 13.20 Irihal says, happiness comes from people, not possessions. 13.21 Irihal says, more often than not, a dose of happiness will cure you of illness faster compared to a week of taking medicines. 13.22 Irihal says, in order to realize the importance of happiness, you have to sometimes face unhappiness. 13.23 Irihal says, I will learn to be happy for no reason at all. 13.24 Irihal says, getting what I need leads to happiness. Getting what I want leads to greed. 13.25 Irihal says, shedding a few tears watching a tearjerker movie does more to generate happiness than all the beer in the world. 13.26 Irihal says, I fight for my own happiness, with myself, not with or through others. 13.27 Irihal says, happiness is a choice. I choose it over and above everything else. 13.28 Irihal says, the tears of today sow the seeds of tomorrow's happiness. 13.29 Irihal says, happy people often look and behave crazy. Copy them. 13.30 Irihal says, I will always strive to be happier than I deserve to be. 13.31 Irihal says, I will always be a warrior and never a worrier. 13.32 Irihal says, count memories, not calories. 13.33 Irihal says, I will measure my life with memories and experiences instead of by years. 13.34 Irihal says, I will be happy at this very moment. 13.35 Irihal says, happiness is an emotion that has to be felt and experienced. It cannot be bought at a store, requested for, owned, or consumed. 14. Food, clothing, and poverty. 14.1 Irihal says, I will always be more concerned about what comes out of my mouth than what goes in through it. 14.2 Irihal says, if I have to eat animals of any kind, I will first thank the animal for giving up its life so that I can be nourished. 14.3 Irihal says, I eat to live, but do not live to eat. 14.4 Irihal says, at the end of a meal, my stomach should have enough space for another. I will always watch how much I eat. 14.5 Irihal says, hunger is economic genocide. 14.6 Irihal says, feeding the hungry is not charity, it is justice. 14.7 Irihal says, success comes to those who are really hungry to achieve their goals. 14.8 Irihal says, we cannot tell a hungry person that we fed them yesterday. 14.9 Irihal says, hunger deprives a person of hope faster and more surely than anything else. 14.10 Irihal says, eating is not the medicine for boredom. 14.11 Irihal says, behind every successful person, there are a lot of hungry days. 14.12 Irihal says, I will always be conscious about being appropriately dressed for every occasion and situation. My dress will always suit the occasion. 14.13 Irihal says, I will like the person regardless of the clothes he or she is wearing. 14.14 Irihal says, it is not about the dress I wear, but the life I lead wearing the clothes that I do. 14.15 Irihal says, the clothes I wear provide hints about who I am. 14.16 Irihal says, I will wear a dress to express myself and to express how I want to be addressed. 14.17 Irihal says, food and clothing has evolved over time depending on the geography, weather, environment, faith, etc. If someone eats or dresses differently for me, they do not become a target of my judgment. 14.18 Irihal says, poverty is the worst form of violence that can be inflicted on anybody. 14.19 Irihal says, a full stomach can never fathom the pain of hunger and poverty. 14.20 Irihal says, an empty stomach and an empty wallet are great teaching moments. 14.21 Irihal says, money does not guarantee happiness, but then neither does milk or alcohol. 14.22 Irihal says, money cannot eradicate poverty, only education can. 14.23 Irihal says, I may not be able to eradicate poverty, but nothing prevents me from feeding a family. 14.24 Irihal says, poverty is not created by poor people. It is created by social, political, and economic injustices thrust upon people. 14.25 Irihal says, to a person living in abject poverty, God appears in the form of food. 15. Respect. 15.1 Irihal says, I will respect myself. If I don't, who will? 15.2 Irihal says, it is not so much about what you say, but how you say it. 15.3 Irihal says, I understand, realize, and accept that respect has to be earned and cannot be demanded. 15.4 Irihal says, I will always respect others, whatever their views, and particularly if those views are contrary to my own. 15.5 Irihal says, if I find myself in a position of power, I will consider it an honor and accept that I have been offered this position because of the goodness of the hearts of the people who have bestowed this honor. 15.6 Irihal says, I will always treat people the way I wish to be treated by them. 15.7 Irihal says, tolerance is about respecting contrary views. 15.8. Irihal says, "To retain my self-respect, I will do what I believe is right, even if it displeases others." 15.9. Irihal says, "The greatest respect I can pay someone is to listen empathetically to what he or she has to say." 15.10. Irihal says, "I will never judge a person by his or her looks. There is a lot to be discovered in every person." 15.11. Irihal says, "I have no right to demand respect if I am not willing to give it." 15.12. Irihal says, "Respect is a lot more important than popularity." 15.13. Irihal says, "I will always be careful that the respect I see towards me is not based on fear." 15.14. Irihal says, "I will be careful never to attack a person's dignity. It is worth everything to him." 15.15. Irihal says, "I will always look at the person, not the title or class or rank or position." 15.16. Irihal says, "There can be no respect without love, and no love without respect." 15.17. Irihal says, "I will always be myself and not compare or compete with anyone else." 15.18. Irihal says, "The inability to truly respect others' differences in opinion is the greatest disability I can have." 15.19. Irihal says, "When I speak, I repeat what I already know. If I listen, I might learn something new." 15.20. Irihal says, "Age or experience or grey hair is no benchmark of respect. Character is." 15.21. Irihal says, "Knowledge provides me with power, while character provides me with respect." 15.22. Irihal says, "Respect those who deserve it, and a lot of people do, but do not idolize anyone." 15.23. Irihal says, "Give respect if you wish to receive respect." 15.24. Irihal says, "Respect can never be based on fear." 15.25. Irihal says, "Earning respect is more noble than earning popularity." 15.26. Irihal says, "Respect people. It might mean a whole lot to them." 15.27. Irihal says, "Respect people in spite of their race, religion, gender, faith, body shape, social status, wealth." It is quite simple, really. 15.28. Irihal says, "Being offended by what someone else believes in is the greatest form of disrespect." 15.29. Irihal says, "We might like or dislike a person, but we have no business to disrespect the individual." 15.30. Irihal says, "We cannot give respect without being intrinsically humble." 15.31. Irihal says, "It is a virtue to be respectful towards others, but it is a sin to lose self-respect." 15.32. Irihal says, "We can never be free until we learn to respect contrary beliefs and opinions." 15.33. Irihal says, develop a mind broad enough to respect the differences that make each of us unique. 15.34. Irihal says, our character is defined by how we treat those who are less privileged than ourselves. 15.35. Irihal says, it is not blood, but respect that binds people together. 16. Death. 16.1. Irihal says, death is the only certainty about life and living. 16.2. Irihal says, death is transitory and is merely a process of transitioning from one body to the next. 16.3. Irihal says, I will not be afraid of death, but will prepare for it, welcome it, and embrace it. 16.4. Irihal says, I will not die till I have managed to fully live. 16.5. Irihal says, I believe that death is liberating. Once I accept its inevitability, I can begin to appreciate the life I'm living today. 16.6. Irihal says, I hope that when my day comes, I will die like a hero going home, with the satisfaction of a life well lived. 16.7. Irihal says, I believe that if I live a full life, I will be prepared and ready to die at any time. 16.8. Irihal says, the most liberating thought I can generate is the acceptance that I'm ready to die. 16.9. Irihal says, it is the desire to live long that makes death so fearful. 16.10. Irihal says, everyone wants to go to heaven, but no one wants to die. 16.11. Irihal says, death to me is like graduation, just one phase of life morphing into another. 16.12. Irihal says, death is nothing more than the peaceful cessation of the functioning of the body as I know it. 16.13. Irihal says, I hope to live a life such that when I die, people around me believe that a part of them has died with me. 16.14. Irihal says, I am much more fearful of living an inadequate life than death itself. 16.15. Irihal says, I would rather die a meaningful death than live a meaningless life. 16.16. Irihal says, I know I am going to die. The when, where, why, and how are entirely irrelevant. 16.17. Irihal says, die young, but as late as possible. 16.18. Irihal says, if I do not die, how can I hope to be reborn? 16.19. Irihal says, when hope disappears, when faith goes, when honor is lost, a person dies. 16.20. Irihal says, some people are so afraid to die that they forget to live. 16.21. Irihal says, if one cannot find something to die for, it becomes very difficult to find something to live for. 16.22. Irihal says, some people die before they actually die. 16.23. Irihal says, I promise to live till I die. 16.24. Irihal says, if I fear death, I slowly die every day that I am alive. 16.25. Irihal says, when I learn to live, I am actually learning to die. 16.26. Irihal says, I will live for today and not spend the rest of my days trying to extend my end of life. 16.27. Irihal says, there is something immensely liberating about the possibility of dying tomorrow. It gives us the freedom to appreciate the here and now. 16.28. Irihal says, we get closer to death from the moment we are born. 16.29. Irihal says, death is the only way we can truly end our suffering. 16.30. Irihal says, death is merely a separation of the soul that was trapped in the body. 16.31. Irihal says, I refuse to be treated with corrective or curative medication at my end-of-life stage. I, however, will accept palliative care. 16.32. Irihal says, I am at liberty to suggest in what way my physical body is to be disposed of after I die. However, since I will no longer be a part of the discussion, I do not care if my suggestions are followed or not. 16.33. Irihal says, I hope that people responsible for rituals after my death follow the principles I believed in and not get sucked into rituals dictated by the community I supposedly belong to. 16.34. Irihal says, death is not a moment of grief, it is a moment of joy. Rejoice in a life well lived, laugh, dance, party. 16.35. Irihal says, I will periodically write my own eulogy and then constantly revise it. 17. About Irihal. 17.1. Irihal says, even though I follow the sayings of Irihal, it does not make me an Irihalite, nor do I profess to follow Irihalism. 17.2. Irihal says, I do not need to pay obeisance to Irihal, but to the sayings and the messages of Irihal. 17.3. Irihal says, I have no wisdom, but a collection of knowledge that I have accumulated over the years. 17.4. Irihal says, I do not confuse the message and the messenger. 17.5. Irihal says, love and respect yourself, first, last, and always, not the messenger. 17.6. Irihal says, do not place Irihal on a pedestal. 17.7. Irihal says, I will welcome any open-ended discussion with anyone who is interested in discussing the sayings of Irihal, without having even the faintest intention of converting them to my point of view. 17.8. Irihal says, in the process of discussing Irihal's sayings with other people, I will remain open-minded to change my own opinions, even if they seem to fall outside the framework of Irihal's sayings. 17.9. Irihal says, if at all you need a symbol, use fire. 17.10. Irihal says, I understand that even though Irihal is represented by fire, I do not need to have a special fire placed in the house. Every time I cook or light a cigarette or create a spark of some sort, Irihal is present. 17.11. Irihal says, do not follow the sayings blindly. Always question and arrive at what works for you. 17.12. Irihal says, you can live any kind of life, or dress in any way you want, or eat any kind of food, or pray in any manner you choose, be married or be a celibate, yet be able to follow the sayings of Irihal. 17.13. Irihal says, since I am following the sayings of Irihal, and not Irihal as a symbol of that source of knowledge, I am not confined by time, space, and dress code in order to follow those teachings. 17.14. Irihal says, I have to cultivate and design my own unique message for my life. Irihal is just the messenger and not the message. 17.15. Irihal says, I am at liberty to renounce Irihal as the messenger, if I so desire. Thus spake Irihal. These are a collection of sayings attributed to Irihal, someone who is definitely not a religious leader, nor a person of flesh and blood. Irihal is not human, certainly not a god, or indeed a god-man. Irihal is not an ism. Think of Irihal as a feeling, an emotion, a guidebook, a dictionary, a series of milestones, who through the collection of sayings helps us navigate this journey called life. Thus Spake Irihal is a collection of wisdom compiled by the followers of Irihal. This might be something difficult to fathom, since Irihal is an emotion and there are no followers who gained the wisdom directly from Irihal. Thus Spake Irihal is a compilation of common sense guidelines that hopefully transcends boundaries, geographies, cultures, people, faith, etc. Irihal is not bound by anything. There is nothing right and there is nothing wrong. These are merely statements that might help people when confronted by situations that seem challenging. Follow the sayings if any or all of them work for you. Dump them if they do not. Feel free to modify them to suit your need. Change them at a later date if circumstances change. Add your own wisdom to Irihal's sayings. That is the beauty of the sayings of Irihal.